27 years we've been asking, who could take a 6-year-old boy and murder him and decapitate him? Who? We needed to know. We needed to know. And today we know.
27 years. That's how long one family waited to hear an answer to a single question. Who took their son and why? This case didn't just haunt a family. It rewrote how an entire country searches for missing kids. A quick note before we start. This case involves the disappearance and death of a child. If that's not something you want to sit with today, that's completely understandable. Feel free to skip this one. Picture this, a department store at midday. Every light on, shoppers everywhere, staff at every register. A police station is close enough to see through the front windows. Your son is in this building somewhere. He has to be. An announcement crackles over the intercom, asking him to come to the front. Nothing. A second announcement. Still nothing. You retrace every aisle, every corner, back to the spot where you left him 15 minutes earlier, where he'd been standing with a small crowd of kids waiting his turn at a new video game display. He'd looked up, said okay, and turned right back to the screen. Now that spot is empty. Not just of him, of every kid who'd been standing there. The screen is dark. The controllers sit untouched. A third announcement goes out, then silence. And in that silence, something has already gone wrong in a way that can't be undone. You just don't know it yet. Welcome to Cold Case Evidence. This is a case that technically closed after 27 years, though plenty of people who've studied it closely would tell you it never really did. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of case we dig into every week. Quick ask before we go further. Cases like this take real time to research properly, and we want to keep telling them right. If you're here because these stories matter to you, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep going. Okay, let's go back to who this boy actually was. Before this becomes a case file, it's worth remembering it started as a child. Born in November 1974, 6 years old, small for his age and proud of every inch of it. Sandy hair, hazel eyes, a face covered in freckles, the kind of look people said belonged on a catalog cover.
He loved baseball. He loved drawing. He called his mother Mommy, watched cartoons on Saturday mornings, and was shy in a way that wasn't performance, genuinely quiet around people he didn't know, needing time before he'd warm up to anyone. His parents knew this about him. It was simply part of who he was. It would end up mattering more than anyone could have imagined. His father was deep into a major hotel development project in Miami, working as a marketing executive, a man who'd built a career from the ground up. His mother split her time between college coursework and competitive bodybuilding, shaping an identity of her own alongside raising her son. From the outside, their home in Hollywood, Florida looked like the version of the American dream people aspire to. A good house, real careers, a marriage, and at the center of it, their only child. The day started like any other Tuesday. Around 9 a.m., a longtime family friend, someone who'd lived with them on and off for years, stopped by the house. The boy's mother asked if he could take her son along to work that day. He said no, the wind was too much for the boat work he had planned, and he had a shoot to prepare for. He left around 10. An hour later, the mother put her son in the car for 2 quick errands. First, a stop at his future school to pay the registration fee for the coming year. Second, a department store at the local mall. She'd been eyeing a lamp there for months, waiting for it finally to go on sale, and she had the newspaper ad in hand. They parked in their usual spot and walked in through the north entrance. That's when he spotted it, a brand new home video game console on display in the toy department, glowing under the store lights. In 1981, this wasn't just a toy, it was a small crowd magnet. And sure enough, a cluster of boys had already gathered around it, taking turns.
His mother did what most parents in that exact situation would do. She scanned the store, security on the floor, staff at every counter, shoppers everywhere. A police station visible right across the street through the window. Broad daylight, one of the most public spaces imaginable. She told him she'd be a few aisles over in the lamp section. He said okay, turned back to the game, and she walked away. The lamp wasn't in stock. The saleswoman was on her lunch break. She left her name and number and headed back. Maybe 10 minutes had passed, 15 at most. The toy department was empty. Every boy who'd been standing there was gone. The screen was dark. Her pulse started to climb. She called his name, walked every aisle, checked anywhere a 6-year-old might wander off to. Nothing. She went to customer service. The first page went out, then a second, then a third. With each one, something in the air of that ordinary Tuesday shifted, because somewhere underneath the panic, she was beginning to understand what her instincts were already telling her. He wasn't in that store anymore. Here's what she had no way of knowing that afternoon, something the store didn't disclose to her, to the responding officers, or to investigators for nearly 3 decades. About 12 minutes after she'd walked off toward the lamps, an argument broke out among a group of boys near the game display over whose turn it was. A store security employee, a teenager working part-time with little to no training for handling this kind of situation, was called over to break it up. She split the group in 2, sending one pair out through the entrance they'd originally come in, and sending the other pair, including her son, out a completely different exit into a section of the parking lot he'd never seen before. When she asked the boy whether his mother was inside the store, he said nothing. He was 6, dressed in green shorts and a red and white striped shirt, almost certainly convinced he'd done something wrong. That same shyness that had never mattered before meant he simply followed the older boy out the door without a word. About half an hour later, that same employee heard his name called out over the store intercom. The store said nothing about what had happened, not to his mother, not to the police, not to the family, not for 27 years. The silence, by most accounts, came down to a fear of legal liability. A 6-year-old boy was standing alone in an unfamiliar parking lot because an undertrained employee sent him out the wrong door, and a corporation chose to protect itself over disclosing what it knew. By around 2 p.m., nearly 2 hours after anyone had last seen him, police were finally called. The station, remember, was visible from inside the store, less than 50 feet across the street. It still took the better part of an hour for an officer to actually arrive. When the boy's father got to the scene, having driven at speed from his office in Miami, the responding officer reportedly brushed him off, suggesting kids often wander off and walk home on their own. The father pushed back hard. This was a 6-year-old who'd never once walked anywhere alone, and he wanted a detective and a supervisor involved immediately. The next day, a newspaper quoted a police source downplaying the case entirely, suggesting the boy was probably just lost, as if a 6-year-old could navigate miles of South Florida highway alone in July heat. The local department was a small suburban force, and the gaps in experience showed almost immediately. The father and a business partner essentially moved into the police station and didn't leave for 2 weeks straight, setting up their own line in case of a ransom call. The mother spent sleepless nights there, fixated on small details, his sandals, whether he'd be cold, whether his feet hurt. They printed roughly 500,000 flyers. The reward climbed, $5,000, then $10,000, then eventually well over $100,000. The father handed out gas money to strangers willing to help search. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers combed fields. Truckers passed information over their radios. But here's the part of 1981 that's easy to forget. None of the systems that exist today existed yet. No nationwide alert network, no dedicated missing children organization. Federal law enforcement legally couldn't step in without proof a state line had been crossed or a ransom demand had been made. Missing children weren't even entered into the National Criminal Database that existed for adults.
When the father pressed a local official about why there was no searchable system at all, the response amounted to a shrug. That's simply how things were. It's a detail that's almost hard to believe now, considering how much infrastructure exists today specifically because of this case. By the end of the first week, national news coverage had largely moved on. The parents had secured a spot on a national morning show set for mid-August, one more chance to put their son's face in front of the country. The night before that broadcast, 2 fishermen were out near a drainage canal well over 100 miles north of where the boy disappeared. Near dusk, they noticed something floating in the water. At first glance, it looked like a doll. It wasn't. The next morning, while his parents were live on national television pleading for his safe return, investigators over 100 miles away were already working to confirm an identification. It came together through multiple independent points: dental records, a visual identification from a close family friend who recognized a distinctive gap in his front teeth, a medical examiner's findings, and, years later, a DNA comparison that confirmed it beyond doubt. The autopsy findings were direct: several blows to the back of the skull from a bladed weapon, along with asphyxiation and facial trauma. Based on the state of the remains, he had likely died within a day or 2 of going missing. He hadn't been kept alive. His parents held a funeral with an empty casket. The remains themselves were still needed as evidence and couldn't yet be released. They stood over a box with nothing inside it and said goodbye in name only. Afterward, the medical examiner took the father aside. He explained the remains couldn't be released yet, but there was something that could still come out of this, a way to make sure his son's death wasn't the end of the story. That single conversation would end up shaping the next 40 decades. But first, there was a killer to find. And what followed was, by almost any measure, one of the most badly mishandled homicide investigations in recent American history.
This is usually the point in a case where we pause, and honestly, it's earned here. Every case we bring you on Cold Case Evidence takes real research, court records, case files, verified reporting, because these were real people, and their stories deserve to be told carefully. If that's the kind of true crime content you want more of, subscribing is what keeps this channel able to keep doing it. Okay, back to the investigation. When a child is killed, statistics point investigators toward people close to the family first, so that's where detectives started. Both parents took polygraph exams. Both passed clean. Then there was the family friend who'd been living on and off with them for years, the same man who'd had breakfast with them the morning the boy vanished. Digging deeper, investigators learned he'd been having an ongoing affair with the boy's mother for roughly 3 years. His first polygraph came back inconclusive. His second came back clean. He underwent hypnosis as part of the process and was eventually cleared entirely. The family never believed he had anything to do with it. But the local department fixated on this angle with an intensity that bordered on tunnel vision. Weeks turned into months. One officer later admitted, in essence, that they'd pushed the boundaries of what was fair in pursuing this man, that they'd done everything short of physically strapping him down. Out of roughly 10,000 pages in the case file, a significant chunk of the early investigation was consumed chasing a theory that led nowhere, while whatever real trail existed went cold in the meantime. 2 years later, just before the statute of limitations would have closed the door entirely, the parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the store, arguing that the security response had been negligent and that the store had known its electronics displays drew in unsupervised kids. The store's legal team countered by arguing the mother herself had been negligent for stepping away and threatened to drag every private detail of the family's life into open court, including the affair. When the store's lawyers subpoenaed active police files, risking exposure of investigative material that could jeopardize any future prosecution, the parents made the difficult call to drop the suit. They had a bigger fight ahead of them. Over the following years, dozens of names moved through the file. Most were ruled out quickly. A few are worth knowing.
One man, already in custody for a separate child abduction, had a cellmate claim he'd confessed to this killing. Investigators searched his car and tested for blood. Nothing conclusive turned up, and his work records placed him elsewhere that day. He passed a voice stress test and was cleared. Another man, later linked to a violent incident involving a machete in Nevada, bragged in prison about being connected to this case. He voluntarily gave a DNA sample decades later and was ruled out. He later admitted he'd only claimed involvement to build a dangerous reputation behind bars. Then, a decade later, a notorious serial killer was arrested in Milwaukee, and it came out that he'd been living in South Florida during the exact summer this case took place. Discharged from military service that spring, effectively homeless, working briefly at a local sandwich shop that used a delivery van matching a description witnesses had given. Multiple witnesses, when later shown photos of both this man and another suspect side by side, pointed to him as the person they remembered seeing near the store that day, not the other man. He denied any involvement when questioned and pointed out, somewhat pointedly, that he'd confessed in graphic, verifiable detail to every other murder he'd committed and had no reason to hide this one if it were true. It's a fair point, but he was also someone capable of years of sustained deception toward the people closest to him. He left Florida within about a month of the disappearance. He was never charged in this case, and the question of his possible involvement was never conclusively closed, just eventually overtaken by other developments. In late 1983, a made-for-TV movie based on the case aired to tens of millions of viewers, ending with photos of other missing children displayed on screen. The next morning, a detective in a nearby county got a phone call, a tip pointing toward a man who'd already come up earlier in the investigation, the same man whose photo had sat next to the serial killers when witnesses were asked to choose between the two. This man was a drifter with a long history of arson, already sitting on death row in Florida for an unrelated murder, serving multiple life sentences when he first confessed to this killing. He and a longtime companion, another man with a violent criminal history, had spent years traveling together and had falsely claimed responsibility for an enormous number of unsolved killings across the country in exchange for privileges, better food, trips outside their cells, anything that broke up the monotony of incarceration. Investigators at the time referred to them, only half-jokingly, as the confession killers, men who habitually claimed crimes they hadn't committed.
His first confession had real problems. He described the boy's clothing incorrectly. He named his usual companion as an accomplice, but that companion turned out to be locked up in a different state entirely on the day of the murder, an airtight alibi. When confronted with the contradiction, he changed his story, insisting he'd acted alone and had only brought up his companion out of habit. But then there were details that lined up disturbingly well. The number of wounds matched the autopsy exactly. The position the body was found in matched. His account of driving north along a specific highway matched. He described a wooden footbridge near where the remains were found, a detail that had never been made public before he said it. And his own movements during the days surrounding the murder were entirely unaccounted for. Investigators tracked down the car he'd reportedly been driving at the time, since repossessed from him by its owner. Testing the interior with a chemical that reveals trace blood, the front and back floorboards lit up. Investigators photographed the car extensively, nearly 100 photos in total. In one image of the carpet behind the driver's seat, something appeared in the illuminated blood pattern that looked, to some who later reviewed it, like the outline of a small child's face. Those photographs were never developed. They sat untouched in storage for 25 years, until a retired detective hired by the family in 2008 became the first person to actually look at them. The carpet itself, the one piece of physical evidence that could have delivered a definitive DNA match, had been cut out of the car, tagged, and left in storage awaiting pickup by the department handling the case. That pickup never happened. The car itself was eventually sold for scrap. The carpet was simply lost somewhere along the way, not stolen, not destroyed in any dramatic fashion, just misplaced while the investigation's attention drifted elsewhere. A second piece of evidence, the weapon itself, also degraded beyond usefulness during early testing. One investigator who reviewed the old photographs later said he believed he could make out a small child's face in the blood pattern. The boy's mother has said she believes it too, while acknowledging they'll likely never know for certain. Over the years, the man confessed and recanted more than 27 times, each version slightly different, each retraction explained away as attention-seeking or an attempt to protect his old companion's reputation. In September 1996, he died in prison from complications related to liver disease and AIDS. He was 49. In his final year, a relative visited him twice and asked him directly whether he'd killed the boy. He said yes, and that he'd always felt bad about it, a confession with nothing left to gain and no one left to perform for.
The family later learned that no one from the department had even known he was dying. Nobody had gone to see him in his final days. In 2008, the parents hired a retired detective and asked him to go through the entire file from start to finish, all 10,000 pages, every interview, every dead end. He concluded that this drifter had in fact been the killer. The department reviewed his findings independently and agreed. In December 2008, the police chief held a press conference with the parents present and formally declared the case closed. He apologized publicly for the investigative failures of the earlier years, mistakes that, had they not happened, might have put the killer in front of a jury while he was still alive. The father, in turn, said the day stood as confirmation that his son's death had ultimately meant something. But it's worth being honest about what that closure actually was. There was no new forensic evidence, no DNA confirmation, no trial. The man named as the killer had already been dead for 12 years. What happened in 2008 was a re-examination of an existing paper trail and a formal statement of confidence, not a jury's verdict. The family got an apology. They never got to see anyone held accountable in a courtroom. Whether the case is truly solved or simply declared over is something people who've read the full file still don't fully agree on. Some investigators remain convinced the stronger case pointed toward the other suspect, the one who was never charged. The lost photographs have since been seen. The carpet itself is gone for good. The uncertainty never fully went away. It was just formally closed instead. 4 days after the funeral, while the case was still wide open and no one had been charged, the parents founded an organization to help other families of missing children. Not months later, 4 days. In 1982, federal legislation was signed requiring missing children to be entered into the National Criminal Database for the first time, closing the exact gap that had cost precious early days in this case. In 1984, the father co-founded what would become the National Center for Missing Children and Exploited, with the boy's mother alongside him every step of the way, having left school entirely to help build it. In 1988, 7 years after the case began, the father became the host of a long-running television program dedicated to tracking down fugitives, a show that ran over 2 decades and helped lead to more than 1,000 arrests, including several individuals on the FBI's most wanted list. In 1994, major retailers across the country adopted a store-wide lockdown protocol for missing children, one that activates the moment a child is reported missing inside a store, locking down every exit until they're found. It's named directly after this case. In 2006, federal legislation strengthened the National Sex Offender Registry and increased penalties for crimes against children, again carrying his name. To date, the organization born out of this case has helped bring home more than 360,000 missing children. He was 6 years old. He loved baseball, loved to draw, and called his mother Mommy. Everything that came afterward, every law, every child found, every fugitive brought in, started in that empty aisle, in a name called out over a store intercom with no one left to answer. If this case stayed with you, that's the point. Subscribe to Cold Case Evidence so you're here for the next file. And if you ever see a child alone somewhere that doesn't feel right, say something. It might matter more than you know.